Hello, and welcome once again to the Just and Sinner podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me, as always, on the program today. And I just want to give you a quick reminder that Just and Sinner as an organization is supported by donors. So if you have benefited from the YouTube videos or the podcast or our articles or books, we ask that you would consider becoming a regular contributor. You can go to justandsinner.org. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, which means any gifts that you give to us are tax deductible. Okay, so we are continuing our series on infant baptism, and this series is one that is hopefully, or at least the plan is, that this is kind of going to be my real last statement or series on the subject of baptism. I've done so much on this topic, and now I'm doing a kind of a deep dive into all sorts of issues. So my hope is that everything is really covered in this series. So this is the third part. If you haven't watched the other two, the first one of these is an introduction to the historical question, which we're delving into more today, and that's dealing with the time of the New Testament. So what historical evidence is there in the first century in both the Jewish context of the New Testament and the text of the New Testament itself, particularly with this language of household baptisms? What evidence is there that infant baptism was being practiced? Then the second part of this series was a theological introduction to infant baptism, a theological defense of infant baptism. And so we have both of these historical elements and the theological elements, which we're going to be diving into throughout this series. And maybe it seems strange to jump to history, to theology, to back to history, but I think it's really important to have the groundwork both in the basics of the history and the basics of theology as we continue this series. So that means we'll be doing a little bit of back and forth, kind of jumping as we go between history and theology, but they should complement one another well. Of course, if you're just interested in the historical question, you can certainly skip the second part and just watch this, but probably watching the first one is, well, maybe it's not absolutely necessary, but it's going to be helpful in introducing what I'm talking about here. Okay, so as a reminder, kind of where we were in the first of this series, and I'm using a number of different books throughout this series, but I'm going back to the texts that were my primary texts for the first part of this series, and that is two books from Joachim Jeremias. The first of these is called Infant Baptism in the First 4 Centuries, and the second one is a response to a critic of his, Kurt Aland, called The Origins of Infant Baptism. And so they're not too long, but there's a lot packed in these texts, as short as they are. So I am going to be largely looking at the evidence that he presents historically. As I mentioned in the first of these videos, these are older texts, and so it's not like there haven't been any responses to the things that he has said in here. However, I do think that the historical evidence still holds up. I think the arguments are still work today, though we will be looking at some critiques of his arguments, or presenting at least some of what the other side might say and does say in response to some of these claims. So last time we did this historical study, we looked at the first century, which is the time period of the New Testament. So we looked largely at the New Testament itself, and the Jewish context of the New Testament, practices of Second Temple Judaism, of proselyte baptisms. So today we're largely going to be looking at the second and the third centuries. Now there is a lot here. I'm not going to delve into extensively into each of the texts that I'm going to be citing here, but honestly, like if I were to do that, this series would be even longer. But if there are particularly relevant ones, or particular ones that are being debated, then I certainly can delve a little more deeply into some of these texts, and at least one of these I am going to do. So the way that the arguments are set forth in Jeremias' book here is he's presenting the evidence in the first couple centuries of the church for the practice of infant baptism, is that he organizes this by different regions of the Roman Empire. And the reason for doing this, or the benefit of doing this, is to show that not only what the practices are in one particular region of the church, but what the church testimony to infant baptism is as a whole. Now, when we look at the early church, it's clear that there are differences regionally, and there are differences even in baptism regionally. That is certainly true. And if we are going to show, say, that there is a lot of testimony to infant baptism, but it's only in, say, what is modern-day Turkey, well, that wouldn't necessarily have the same kind of weight as it would if we were to demonstrate that that practice is also in Rome, and if it's happening, in Egypt and all throughout the empire, the Roman Empire. So we're going to start with Asia Minor here. Now, the first piece of evidence we're going to look at is one that is discussed a lot in a lot of these conversations, and it is one that I think is often among Baptists or Credo Baptists, or not necessarily even Credo Baptists, like Lund actually was not, who argued against Hieronymus, but those who argue the other side historically, is a quote that comes from Polycarp, or is attributed to Polycarp, which shows up in an early Christian text, very widely read text, called the Martyrdom of Polycarp. Now, if you're not familiar with Polycarp, Polycarp was an early Christian author. He is one of those who are given the title the Apostolic Fathers. And so the Apostolic Fathers is a term that is used to describe the earliest Christian writers outside of the New Testament. And so the Apostolic Fathers are ones who were contemporaries with the apostles, who had known some of the apostles, or at least one of the apostles. And that's what we find here with Polycarp. And so Polycarp had known Saint John. Now, Saint John was the last of the apostles to die sometime at the end of the first century. And so as we start looking at writing in the second century, he's the apostle that is most likely that these individuals would have come across. Now, we don't have an extensive amount of writings of Polycarp. We have one letter of his, which is to Smyrna. So Polycarp's letter to the Smyrnians, we see Smyrna mentioned in the book of Revelation. And there is an early account of Polycarp's martyrdom. And according to this account in Polycarp's martyrdom, Polycarp uses this phrase as he's going to death. He says, "For 86 years I have served him, and he has done me no wrong." Okay, well, let's pick this apart and say, what does this have to do with infant baptism? Now, there's no mention of baptism in this text. He never says, that he was baptized 86 years before that. We don't even know how old Polycarp was at his death. Maybe he was 102, and he had served God since he made a decision for Jesus, at 16 years old or whatever. Well, it's highly unlikely that Polycarp was any older than 86. I mean, 86 is an extremely long age it's still a long age to have lived today, but it's an extremely long age for someone to have lived in the ancient Roman world. And so most likely Polycarp is not 100 years old. There's a low likelihood that that's the case. If it was the case, long lives like this, when they do happen, are often seen in the ancient world as evidences of a kind of holiness, that people are going to mention how long they lived. It's a sign of supernatural protection. And this happens not just within Christian sources. I'm saying this happens in all sorts of sources. And so if Polycarp had lived past 100 years old, there would have been mention of that, because that would have been also this kind of further evidence of the holiness of Polycarp. So most likely he's 86 years old, which again is also really old. So the point of this is to say that Polycarp is, when he's speaking about his faith, saying that he has served God, he has served Christ for his entire life. And so Polycarp is not speaking about some kind of a conversion experience that he has later in life. And this is part of a pattern that we talked about in the first video in this series that we're going to continue to see as we look at the historical sources. And that is that the way that people speak in the faith, speak of their childhood or the childhood of other Christians, is such that there is no expectation of a conversion experience in life at some point for the child. The way that children are spoken of repeatedly is as if you're raised in a Christian family, you are a Christian from your youngest childhood. That seems to be the norm, that seems to be the standard, that seems to be the expectation. There is no early Christian testimony which speaks of a certain age of a Christian child where that child now needs to make a decision for themselves, to make the faith their own. This kind of language is completely absent, and it's just not how ancient people saw themselves in their relation to their families. And so we see this very consistent pattern in looking at the early church, that it is again and again and again and again, and there's one possible exception to this, and we'll look at that, but is over and over again just stated and assumed that if one is a Christian, the children are also Christians. And when those who are raised in Christian families describe their childhoods, repeatedly they speak about it as if they were always Christians. They don't speak about their childhoods as if they had to make their faith their own at some point and then convert themselves and receive baptism at some point. So this is not an explicit testimony of baptism here. However, what it does tell us is something about how Polycarp looked at himself in his relation with his faith, to his family, and his upbringing. And as the earliest Christians repeatedly speak about their relation to God being established by baptism, that is that which makes individuals Christians, that's the initiation into the Christian life, it is highly likely that Polycarp is thinking about specifically his baptism. So it doesn't explicitly say infant baptism, but it seems to be an indication of this text. And again, even if you don't want to go that far, it certainly says something about how he saw himself in relation to the faith of his parents as one raised in a Christian home. Okay, then let's look at some other evidence in Asia Minor of infant baptism, or things related to infant baptism. Now here we have a man named Polycrates, who is the bishop of Ephesus. He writes to Rome around 190 AD, and he's writing to Rome about a debate surrounding the date of Easter. And this debate around the date of Easter is one of the earliest Christian controversies. It seems like a rather silly thing to spend that much time debating about, of all of the things that are really essential theologically in the faith. Exactly what day you celebrate Easter doesn't seem to be all that important, but people at the time certainly seemed to think it was important. So we don't have a ton of Christian writings from the 2nd century, but a lot of what we do have or have reference to is dealing with this debate or this discussion. The more theological stuff deals with the question of the Gnostics. And as he is writing this letter, he uses this phrase. He says that he had lived in the Lord, ekon en kurio, for 65 years. And so this is cited by Eusebius in Eusebius' Ecclesiastical History, which is where a lot of this information is going to come from. So there are all sorts of documents and letters and things that are written that are no longer extant, that Eusebius, we have to rely on Eusebius for these kinds of things. Okay, so according to Eusebius' account, this man who was 65 years old, and again, this man was likely not 90 years old writing this. People don't live that long. 65 is a pretty old man at this time. And so he saw himself in relationship to God from the time of his birth, from his childhood. And so for 65 years, he has lived in the Lord. Now, this language of being in the Lord, en kurio, this is not the kind of phrase that just means perhaps when people say things like, well, the year of our Lord, whatever. Like this isn't just a generic phrase to say, you just talk about all time as being in the Lord or of the Lord or something like that. But lived in the Lord is specifically identifying that he had lived in connection with the Lord. He had been in connection and lived his life in Christ for 65 years. Now, how does one live in Christ for this extensive amount of time? Well, it begins with baptism, because in baptism we are incorporated in Christ. And so that's why there is all this language. You see, if you can watch the video if you haven't before this, I talk about a lot of that in Christ kind of language connected to baptism in the New Testament. But being in the Lord is very baptismal kind of language. Okay, then we have a very well-known early mention of Christianity. It's really the earliest mention of Christians as a group from outside of Christians themselves, and this comes from Pliny the Younger, who has a very well-known letter written sometime between, say, 112 and 113 AD. And in this letter, he's mocking the Christians, he's critiquing the Christians. But one of the things that he says is he talks about how amid the Christians within the church, those who are members of the church, they include the young teneri is the word he uses there. And he further mentions in this letter that those of all ages belong to the church, multi omni aetatis. And so this gives a view from the outside, not someone within the church, of how it is that Christians included the young within their assemblies, within their worship. And so Pliny makes a point of this because it's a bit unusual that this is the case, that the young are looked at with belonging in this way. Again, not an explicit reference to baptism, but it does certainly point in that direction. Okay, then we have the Acts of the Martyrs, which is a later historical Christian text. Now, if you look at these kind of early books of Acts, Acts of this person, Acts of Paul and Thecla, we get all these different texts. There's obviously some elaboration on certain things, and I think we see that pretty clearly in most of these texts. So the point, I think, of looking at these texts is not to say that the historical events being recorded happened exactly in this way. In some ways, that doesn't really matter, because what we're looking at is what early Christians who authored these texts believed about these things. It gives you an idea, regardless of the historical veracity of all the things that are recorded, it gives you an idea of what the one writing the text actually believed. And so this mentions a trial of Papylus of Thyatira, who says, I have served God from my youth up. Again, language of serving God from youth. So what we see again is just this continuity. There is a kind of assumed continuity from young ages to today. There is a remaining in the faith. There is a serving God at young ages, and then one is brought up in the faith and continues in the faith. Just as David in the Psalms speaks about serving God while he was breastfeeding. Okay, then in a book called The Acts of Justin and His Companions, we have a similar testimony. Eupistus says, I also received Christianity from my parents. And so there is, again, an assumption that the parents just pass on their faith to the child. So if the parents are converts, the child also is a convert. Hierax similarly says, and this is also recorded in that same book, Acts of Justin and His Companions, he also says, I always have been, and ever shall be a Christian. I always have been a Christian, and I always will be a Christian. And again, this gives you the idea of how the early Christians looked at their children and how those who are raised in Christian homes viewed themselves. They're not thinking, I wasn't a Christian, I was a pagan until I had a conversion experience. They're just thinking, my parents are Christian, I'm a Christian, and I'm still a Christian. Okay, then we have, again, from the same text, Acts of Justin and His Companions, Pion, who says, we received from our parents this good confession. And so you see all of these testimonies say essentially the same thing, which is that if you're in a Christian family, you receive the gifts of Christianity from your parents, and you carry those forth. There is no conversion experience. There's the assumption that this belongs to them, which, again, certainly fits much better with an infant baptism perspective on how you should look at your children and bring them into the church. Because the Credo Baptist perspective really necessitates this idea that one has to make a personal decision at some point, rather than the faith and the grace of God being simply passed on from one generation to the next. Then we have Maximus of Asia, and he died around 250 AD. This is from that same text, Acts of Justin and His Companions. He speaks of offering sacrifices to the one God, to whom I am glad to say I have offered sacrifice from my earliest youth. From the earliest youth, so the youngest years, Maximus is seeing himself as offering praise and sacrifice to God. Canon of Magadis, who died at the same time, around 250 AD, he says, I have a family connection with Christ, whom I serve as did my forefathers. So a family connection with Christ. You see, when you read these texts, it really challenges the individualistic way that we think about our faith. There is a connection between parent and child that is assumed in the ancient world that we neglect and we don't assume. And so when we read these texts, I think what we would expect to find if they thought like we did, that the parents were faithful perhaps in, in teaching the faith, but that they made the faith their own. And they're thankful for their godly parents, but they converted as some kind of separate event. Again, same thing you see in all of these texts. Okay, one more of these, and evidence in Asia Minor. Asterius of Lycia, who died sometime in the 3rd century, we don't have the exact date, who said, "I was taught by my parents to worship and love God." Acts of Claudius, Asterius, and their companions. Okay, again, over and over and over again, it's assumed parents convert, whole family converts with them. The faith is simply passed on to the next generation. They serve God their whole lives. All right, now let's move into Egypt. Well, the first thing I want to look at is a citation that comes from Clement of Alexandria, and he's writing sometime between 190 and 200 AD here, who uses a phrase that, if taken out of context, certainly seems to be talking about infant baptism. But in light of the context and of just how Clement tends to write about children in general, more of as examples than directly about children, it's probably not a direct reference to infant baptism, but it is one that people often cite, so it's worth at least mentioning it. He speaks of children who are drawn from the water. And it's likely, he's certainly talking about baptism here, but it's likely that he is speaking about children or infants in the faith, the new Christian as a child, rather than literal children. Again, most likely, but not absolutely certain, so it's possible. Now I want to talk about the figure who is one early figure, one of the earliest figures, who's really explicit about infant baptism. And so in the text we just looked at, we're looking at early Christian testimonies about how they viewed their children, but now we're speaking explicitly about baptism. So we find this in Origen. Now, if you're not familiar with Origen, Origen is the most important Christian theologian of the 3rd century, early 3rd century at least, and especially hugely influential at his time. Origen was a student of Clement of Alexandria, and there are two things that are really important to keep in mind as we are talking about Origen and his relation to infant baptism. The first of these is that Origen traveled really extensively throughout the empire. And so Origen spent a significant amount of time, not just in Alexandria, Egypt, where he lived and taught, but also in Rome and throughout North Africa. Origen traveled very widely around the church. And Origen was widely respected all across the Christian world. So when we look at somebody like Origen and he speaks about a practice, and he explicitly refers to that practice as something that had been passed on or was the practice of the apostles, he would have a much better idea of what general Christian practices were within the empire than some individuals who pretty much stayed wherever it was that they grew up. You get somebody like the Venerable Bede in the Middle Ages who supposedly never left his hometown in his entire life, which is kind of a crazy thing, for modern people, but that wasn't that unusual. So, and certainly the Christians are kind of writing back and forth, writing letters to each other, but Origen, more than most, would be able to tell us about whether a practice was really more universal. The second thing that's really important to keep in mind as we are thinking about Origen and the importance of his testimony on this subject is that Origen came from a family that had been Christian for several generations. And so we know this from Eusebius, who speaks about Origen. Origen later becomes a rather controversial figure in many ways. But this shows us that when Origen is speaking about a practice, again, he's not just talking about a practice that he thinks Christians should engage in. He speaks of infant baptism as if it is a practice that Christians just do, that is apostolic, and he both has a way to judge that in terms of his own history, in his family history, as well as in the breadth of the empire, geographically. So this is why Origen is really the most important, in some ways, testimony of this era. And he's also the most explicit, and he wrote a lot. So Origen wrote more than most people at this time, really more than anybody else at his time. And supposedly he had these kind of scribes that basically followed him around, and Origen was a philosopher and really the first systematic theologian in the church. And as Origen said things, as he'd have these scribes kind of write down whatever he said, who followed him around. So we've got a lot of stuff from Origen, which really helps. And so when people throw out the objection, you're going to hear this quite a bit, that in the 2nd century we have, these things about mentions of children, but we don't have these explicit discussions of infant baptism. The fact is we don't have that much writing from that time period. And the writing that we do have addresses very specific issues. So prior to the time of Origen, we don't have people really just writing about the faith in general. We have, Irenaeus, who we'll talk about here, who I think has a rather explicit statement about infant baptism. But he's writing, against the Gnostics, and we have people defending Christianity against paganism. It's not really, so infant baptism or sacramental practice isn't really the first thing that's in view in the purpose of these writings. So we shouldn't necessarily expect to find a lot of explicit references because we don't have that much written material, and the written material that we do have is not addressing that issue. Okay, so on Origen. Well, we have a first reference is in his homilies on Luke. This is in homily 14. He's commenting on Luke 2:22, and he says that therefore children are also baptized. Okay, very explicit. Children are also baptized, so he believes in infant baptism. The second reference in Origen comes from his homilies on Leviticus, and this is commenting on Leviticus 12:2. He says that baptism is given, quote, according to the custom of the church to infants also. So this is important. He's saying according to the custom of the church. He's not making a theological argument that infants should be baptized. He is simply saying this is just what the church does. The custom of the church is that the church baptizes infants. Again, we can look at this in his own family history. He's hearing about this, and he's seeing this as he's traveling throughout the Roman Empire. Third reference, this is in his commentary on the book of Romans. This is a comment on Romans chapter 6, verses 5 through 7. He says, for this reason, moreover, the church received from the apostles the tradition of baptizing infants too. So Origen at least believes that this is the practice, again, of the whole church, and Origen believes that this was what the apostles taught and passed on to the whole church. So he believes it at least to be an apostolic practice. There is a possible fourth reference to infant baptism in his homilies on Joshua, and that's really, regardless of whether you have that citation or not, the other three are really explicit. And so there is certainty here that Origen believed in infant baptism, and that Origen believed further that this was the practice of the whole church, and that it was passed on from the apostles. So it's apostolic teaching. Now, in the reasoning for infant baptism, it's worth noting that every time Origen brings up this issue, he cites the same text, and that is Job 14:4, which states that nobody is pure from stain even though he is just a day old. This is interesting for a lot of reasons, but one is that it does display part of the reason, or really the reason, that Origen believes that infants should be baptized, which is that infants have a stain. There is something sinful even in the nature of infants. Now, Origen doesn't present a lengthy discussion of some theory of original sin, and Origen has some weird ideas too about the pre-existence of souls and stuff. And he does believe there's some connection between us and Adam, that the fall affects all of us, and it's connected to all of that. But I'm not saying that he has a completely kind of maybe Augustinian view of original sin, as you might find developed later. But we do see the rationale for baptizing infants, which is, according to Origen, again, he's receiving this from others and believes his apostolic teaching. He believes that the reason that this is done is because there is something corrupt about nature, even from the time of birth, so that baptism needs to take care of what is wrong with our nature. And if infants have that fallen nature, they need the remedy for that in baptism. And so baptism forgives sins, it cleanses nature. This is pretty clear from the earliest of Christian sources that speak about baptism. Now, I'm not talking here extensively about what the early Christians said about what baptism does. I do want to do that, but that'll be a separate talk. Okay. Again, he does refer to the practice of infant baptism as an apostolic tradition, ecclesia ab apostolis traditionem soscepit. So he believes that this, again, is practice from the apostles. There is a mention here that Jeremias makes in Egypt of an Egyptian mummy that is of a very young child who is identified as a Christian. That child dies at 4 years old and is holding a cross. So this is just a demonstration. And there isn't like a lengthy inscription or something that we get along with this, but this is a demonstration of the fact that those who died very young in Christian families were seemingly identified as Christians. Then we get to Syria. Now, at least what Jeremias is going to say is that in Western Syria and Eastern Syria, we do seem to have some distinct practices. And so he is going to argue that in Western Syria, we have clear evidence of infant baptism as the practice. We don't have that much evidence either way, to be honest here. And then he's going to say in Eastern Syria, it seems that baptism had been delayed, and there are some certain reasons for that. So there is a likely affirmation in Western Syria of infant baptism in the Pseudo-Clementines, and this is circa 220 to 230. Clement is the same Clement here that writes the epistle to the Corinthians, called Clement of Rome, he's known as. And there are a bunch of things that are attributed to Clement that he didn't write. Now, this text contains a narrative, and in this narrative, the Apostle Peter, is explaining to Matidia, who is Clement's mother, that Christians cannot sit at tables to eat with the unbaptized. And it's explicitly mentioned that Christians can also not eat even with family members who are the unbaptized. It even mentions children explicitly. It says wives and children, but singles out children. And this same thing is then reiterated by Peter in this narrative to Clement's father, Faustus. Now, this would be a very strange thing to do if your children weren't baptized, because then you can't even eat at the table with your children. And it seems pretty clear that that's not what he's saying here. So by every indication, the children must have kind of been baptized in order to come together at the table. So not an explicit reference to infant baptism, but again, certainly points in that direction. Now, there are several explicit references to infant baptism in Western Syria throughout the 4th century. So by the time you get to the time of the Council of Nicaea, especially late 4th century, then you get a lot of references to infant baptism all over the place, because by that time we just have a lot more writings. Christianity is legalized under Constantine, and so there's just a lot more going on. There's a lot more evidence here. And so just to point out a couple of these sources, in the 4th century you have Asterius, the sophist, early to mid 4th century, who mentions it, and then the Apostolic Constitutions, 370 to 380 AD is the dating there. There's a lot of debate actually about the dating of the Apostolic Constitutions, but that's just what Jeremias at least gives for the dating there. Now, Jeremias does, as I said, make the claim that Eastern Syria didn't have the same practice. And so he's going to say that Eastern Syria is the one exception to this where it seems like there really isn't evidence of infant baptism being practiced. And even then, there's not that much to go on. And this is the difficulty here. We just have very little evidence one way or another on this issue here. And it seems, I think, in Western and Eastern Syria, there's not very much evidence, at least in terms of what he pulls out. Now, Jeremias makes an argument that the reason why this would have happened in Eastern Syria is because of the presence of the Marcionites. Now, Marcion was the first great Christian heretic, if you could call a heretic great, the first one that really makes a big splash and has a significant following that the earliest Christians write a lot about. And so Marcion denies the inspiration of the Old Testament. That's what he's probably most well known for. He has his own version of Christianity, which is a much shortened version of, of the New Testament. And the Marcionites had all sorts of kind of wild ideas. And so the Marcionites refused communion to those who were married unless they had taken a vow of celibacy. They were actually often encouraged to get divorced right after converting to Christianity because you were supposed to be single. And so those who were single prior to taking communion needed to make a commitment that they would not get married. They would take a lifelong vow of celibacy. And so there actually are, at least according to one account, there are those Marcionites who also abandoned their children after converting. So the Marcionites had a view of family relations that was clearly not consistent with the rest of the church. So if they have this significant influence on the church in Eastern Syria, it kind of makes sense that of all places, this would be where infant baptism would be challenged. Then we have evidence in Greece. Aristides of Athens, in his Apology, and so you have a number of these early Christian writers who write books called the Apology, which is just their defense of Christianity, usually against paganism in Rome. And so he says this about Christians, that when a child is born to them, they thank God, and if it dies in infancy, they thank him exceedingly, because it departed from this life sinless. Well, that is a weird quote. What is he talking about here? Well, why would they thank God that an infant died? Well, Jeremias makes the argument that he says this phrase, they thank God, as you read throughout this treatise, he uses this with reference to very specific rites and prayers. They thank God. So he's not just saying, they have thankfulness in their hearts, but he's saying that there is an explicit rite or prayer by which they are offering God thanks. And so what he's saying is that they're thanking God, not because the infant died, but they're thanking God because grace has been applied to the infant, which is why he says that this infant departed from life sinless. And so there are different ways that one could understand this phrase, that they departed from life sinless. Of course, one way to interpret that is just to say that, well, these infants didn't sin yet, so it's good that they died before they could sin. Well, there's another way to interpret this, which is to say that being sinless means being cleansed in baptism. And this is very common language for early Christians to use with reference to baptism, that one is sinless, that your sins are forgiven. It's what they're really trying to say. And this kind of language is used in early baptismal liturgies as well. And so Jeremias cites some liturgical historians who just say this is clearly a reference to infant baptism here, because that is the rite by which this occurs. Now, it again may seem strange that there's no explicit reference to baptism, but you do have to recognize that in many of these apologies, these writings to pagans, Christians don't write that often in detail about Christian ceremonies and sacraments. And they don't really intend to, because that's not really the purpose for which they are writing. The only exception to that is when they write about the Eucharist, and the reason they do that is because of misunderstandings of Holy Communion. But generally, the discussions about the sacraments are really more internal than they are discussed with those who are outside of the church. Okay, then we have evidence in Italy and Gaul. Justin Martyr, and Justin Martyr is going to be a hugely significant voice, very important thinker for the history of the church. He's writing in the 2nd century. First Apology, which is sometime between, around 150-ish to 155-ish. He says that in this work, many men and women of the age of 60 and 70 years who have been disciples of Christ from childhood had retained their, the Christian faith throughout their lives. And so this is that same pattern that we see over and over and over and over again in these early sources, that it is the expectation that when you have children, those children are considered Christians and are until they die, because they will continue in the faith, or at least that's the hope, that they continue in the faith, not that they convert someday. And so he says that this is the way that it is in the church. Now he's living in the early to mid 2nd century here. And so these are 2nd generation, 3rd generation Christians, still pretty closely connected to the time of the apostles. But now at this time, there are people being raised in the faith. And this is just the pattern that they receive. They are disciples of Christ. And so there's significance actually in that language of disciple from childhood, because he doesn't just say they were taught about Jesus from their childhood. He says they were disciples of Jesus. And so the assumption is that they are followers of Jesus who are disciples, but the baptized. And so this is not just about faithful Christian parents teaching the faith, hoping that the children become disciples, but from childhood they are disciples. They have a direct relation to Jesus. They're his disciples. They belong to him. Irenaeus, really significant voice he's born sometime around 130-ish AD. And Irenaeus knows Polycarp, who knows John, and he includes the story about the Apostle John in his writing. So he has some pretty direct knowledge of what was apostolic practice. He didn't know John personally. It's not quite that early, but only 2 generations now removed from the apostles pretty directly. And Against Heresies, which is Irenaeus's massive theological tome and critique of the Gnostics. The point of the book is not to lay out really sacramental theology or something. He's critiquing the Gnostics, and so everything that he says has some reference to something about the Gnostics that he's critiquing. So it's not meant to be a dogmatics textbook or something. But he does say this. He says, "For Jesus has come to save all of them by himself. I say, all those, I say, who through him are reborn to God, infants, young children, boys, the mature and older people." So they are reborn to God. Well, what does that mean? That even infants and young ones are reborn to God? Well, rebirth and regeneration, those terms are tied to baptism explicitly in Irenaeus' writing and in really all other early Christian writings. So this seems to be a very clear reference to infant baptism that you find in Irenaeus. Then you have Hippolytus, and this is really explicit. This is from the apostolic tradition circa 215. Now, I do have to say this, that there is some debate about the authorship of this text. And so during Jeremias' time, it was pretty well affirmed, concluded that Hippolytus was the author of this text, but there have been some doubts about that. So it's important to put that out here to say, yes, there's some debate about this. I'm not going to get into that debate right now, but take it as a piece of evidence, but do so with some caution there. But he has explicit references to infant baptism in this text. He writes, "First, you should baptize the little ones. All who can speak for themselves should speak, but for those who cannot speak, their parents should speak, or another who belongs to their family." So this shows the early Christian practice of infant baptism. And Hippolytus is another one who is in a multi-generational Christian family. So if he is indeed the author of this text, he is receiving the faith from a couple different generations prior to him. But this is an explicit instruction to baptize infants. Okay, then we move to North Africa. Now, in North Africa, we are going to find the name that shows up in these discussions of infant baptism, the history of infant baptism more than any other, and that is Tertullian. Tertullian is sometimes referred to as the father of Western theology. He is one of the most important writers in the early church. Tertullian did have some odd views about the relationship between the Christian and sin and repentance and marriage and a number of other things as well. But Tertullian writes this treatise on baptism in which he challenges the practice of infant baptism. And the fact that he does that shows us that infant baptism was a practice at Tertullian's time. But it also does show what the earliest arguments against infant baptism were. Now, I'm going to do something separate on Tertullian's treatise, because I think that there's a lot we're talking about in there, a lot that it demonstrates in there, and I think there are a lot of misunderstandings of Tertullian's treatise by people who have heard a few things about it but haven't actually read the text themselves. So we're going to actually go through some portions of that text and talk about what this controversy exactly was about and what this tells us about what the early church believed about baptism and the practice of infant baptism. Okay. But it does seem that even though Tertullian was such a significant voice in the North African church, it doesn't seem that he had this kind of profound, definitive impact upon the rest of the church here on this issue. So it's not like everybody just followed whatever Tertullian said and then the North African church just didn't baptize infants. So we have plenty of evidence after Tertullian that the North African church did baptize infants. Cyprian mentions this. Now, Cyprian, another hugely significant name, 3rd century. Cyprian mentions in his 64th letter that there was a synod that was held at Carthage, and this is sometime between 252 and 253. Rejected the view of the synod, rejected the view of Bishop Fidus, and Bishop Fidus had argued that infants should be baptized on the 8th day. And the reason for that is, well, circumcision was on the 8th day. There is this connection between baptism and circumcision that Paul makes in the book of Colossians, and so the church should follow that in baptizing on the 8th day. So the synod at Carthage rejects that view, and it rejects that view because the synod did not believe, or those who were present at the synod did not believe that that was early enough. And so they argued that it needs to happen within the first couple days. And the reason for this, like today, you look at this and you think, oh, that's kind of silly. Why would that be the case? But infant mortality rates were far higher in the ancient world. You didn't have the kind of medical care you have today. And so there was a desire for a kind of immediacy in administering baptism to the infant, just in case something happened. And so it was moved earlier. So we see with Cyprian evidence that he wants baptism, a couple days, just a couple days after birth. There's also a mention in De Lapsis from Cyprian of the practice of infant communion, even that had been happening in North Africa. It is important to mention that Carthage is a very important seat in North Africa, very important place for the development of theology, and it was kind of the center of North African theology was there in Carthage, and so it's not an ecumenical council or something, but it does show what the beliefs of people throughout this region believed about this practice. All right, and so they're even communing infants, and so you have to have a pretty strong view of infants in their relation to Christ to start communing infants, and the infant communion is a whole other rabbit hole that we're not going down at the moment here. Okay, then we have another piece of evidence here, and that is a number of Christian infant death inscriptions. And so we have a number of inscriptions on graves of infants that speak about infants as if they are Christians, or young children as if they are Christians. There are a ton of these, and these are from varied regions. These are from all over the empire here. We're not just talking about in one particular place. So just some of these, there's an inscription of a 1-year-old Eutychianus, circa 200 AD, where he is marked as Dei Servus, meaning servant of God. Okay, so then we have an inscription of infant Kyriakos from the 3rd century, which is he's referred to as Hagnon Paidion, which means holy infant. A 3rd century inscription of a child in Rome who died at an early age. There's no explicit age given, it just says young, is referenced to as baptized explicitly. Lavacro is the word that's used there. There's an inscription of an infant named Dionysius, described as innocent and as lying with the holy ones. And so all of these, you have this language of holiness that you see a couple different places here of those infants who die. You have an inscription of a 2-year-old child named Pompania Fortunata in the 3rd century who died in peace. And this also includes the image of the ichthus, known as the Jesus fish today. So there's a Christian imagery on the grave and peace, which is, yes, it's something today that we use a lot to talk about death in general, but here this is a Christian language about the state of death. Inscription of a 3-year-old named Innocens that includes the phrase, through the Holy Spirit, innocent who died at 3 years old. There's another inscription which is possibly from the 3rd century of a child who was not yet 1 year old, which uses the phrase, remain with you, directed toward the child in peace. Zosimus from the 3rd century died at 2 years old and is described as a believer, pistos, and also one who is from believers, ek piston. Jeremias notes that the identification of believer is distinctly given to the baptized in the early church, as those who did not yet receive the sacrament were referred to as catechumens rather explicitly. And there's another probably 3rd century text that mentions 3 12-year-old boys who are said to be born of the faithful or of Christians and are also thus Christians. There's this connection again between the parents are Christians, the children are also Christians. Okay, then we have some emergency baptism inscriptions, and here is where we get to the argument that's going to be made for the Credo Baptist side on the historical issue, because it is going to be argued generally that this issue of infant mortality became the rationale for infant baptism, so that infant baptism was not practiced in the early church, very often at least, certainly not universally, and then they would say that, well, this issue of infant mortality, infants constantly dying, caused Christians to start saying maybe we should baptize our infants so that they have cleansing and the forgiveness of sins just in case they die. There is an inscription in the Priscilla Catacomb that states, Irene, who lived with her parents for 11 months and 6 days, received baptism on the 7th day before the Ides of April and gave her soul on the Ides of April. Now, the word baptism actually doesn't show up here. It's received on the 7th day, but that language is what we find in these inscriptions throughout the Christian world. So that's not just being inserted here as some kind of guess of that was meant. That's just a common practice, and we know that to be the case. That's not really disputed. Then we have Sweet Tyche lived 1 year, 10 months, and 15 days. She received baptism on the 8th and gave her soul on the day mentioned above. So we see that language of received, that means baptized, and gave means gave her soul. So these are both on the same day. They're on the same day, seemingly, because those individuals were going to die, and because it seemed that they were going to die, those baptisms were administered. Now, this next one here is one that we'll have to deal with separately when we start to look at objections and the evidence for the other side that is proposed for the lack of infant baptism in the early church. And this is from 268 AD. It speaks of the baptism of a 12-year-old named Marcianus, who was baptized on his deathbed. The reason for the delay in baptism is not clear. So this is going to be the example that is used to say, well, he's 12 years old, and he was baptized on his deathbed, just like these other infants were baptized on his deathbed, which means that this individual, Marcianus, was not baptized as an infant, and early Christians didn't baptize in infancy. It was only because he was going to die that they decided to baptize him. So they're going to say that, yes, the practice of infant baptism that we do see is really only due to cases of emergency. And so like we see with Marcianus, when an infant seems like that infant is going to die, then baptism is administered because baptism must be administered prior to death. That's going to be the argument. Now, it's not clear, again, what the reason for Marcianus' delay in his baptism was. There is an argument which says that Marcianus actually was probably not the child of Christian parents himself, and so because of that, there was no baptism, but he came into contact with Christians later and was baptized. There's little information about this, and we'll have to look a little bit more at the details about that and how to try to reckon with that as we look at some of the objections. Well, there you go. That's all I wanted to cover today in looking at the evidences from the 2nd and 3rd centuries for infant baptism. And the other things that I want to do in the historical section here, I don't want to do a ton more with it, but I would like to do one that covers the objections to infant baptism. What's the history of what goes on with Tertullian, and then what happens after that into the 4th century. And then I would like to look at some objections. And then at some point, it may be worthwhile to then, as I mentioned before, just go back and look at what the early Christians said baptism did. I think that would probably be worthwhile. So then maybe there'll be about 3 more of those in this historical section. And then we'll also be going through each of the texts that are in the New Testament on baptism and exploring those in context. Then we are going to look at just some general questions and objections to infant baptism as a whole. So we'll see how long this series is. I was hoping to do about 10 parts, but you know me, if you watch this channel, I have a hard time keeping things even that brief. So we'll see. And we'll see who's watching this. I'm still listening to these, after we keep going. The problem with doing series like this is that you get a lot of people watch the first one, and then the number drops off successively in each part of the series, which kind of de-incentivizes the whole idea of doing series in the first place, but I really like doing these because that's where you actually get some significant depth. But make sure that you subscribe, and both on YouTube and your podcast app. Make sure you comment, share, all of that stuff. It helps, and we'll see you in the next video. God bless.